Hello, back again on the Top Recap channel. This time I will tell a movie's entitled Jack Reacher. Let's get straight into the storyline. The film opens with a mysterious sniper aiming at a target from the top of a building. For reasons unknown, he suddenly shoots 5 random civilians, causing panic in the area. After the shooting, police officers led by a detective named Emerson arrive at the scene. According to Emerson, the building was where the perpetrator carried out his actions. During the investigation, the detective found a bullet casing and a coin. This made it easy for the police to find out who was behind it all. In short, Emerson immediately scanned a coin he had found. It was revealed that the person who carried out the shooting was a young man named James. The police, who received the information from Emerson, immediately arrested the man at his residence. After successfully arresting James, they immediately interrogated him. Emerson was assisted by a prosecutor named Prosecutor Rodan. What was most unusual was that the suspect's face was completely different from the person seen at the beginning of the film. However, the man immediately handed over a piece of paper with the words Jack Reacher written on it. Emerson and the prosecutor were confused by the name James had written. Since they had no certainty, they decided to search for information about Jack Reacher on Google. From the information, it was revealed that Jack was a former military officer who had received numerous awards for his successful missions in various countries.
Why? At least not under his real name.
While they were discussing the man, Jack Reacher suddenly appeared before them. His purpose was to assist in the investigation of someone who had killed 5 civilians at once. Jack was certain that James was not the real culprit. When Jack wants to check on James, he is worried that James has already been beaten up. Prosecutor Rodan informed Jack that James had been beaten by inmates while en route to prison. After leaving the room, a woman named Helen, who was the daughter of Prosecutor Rodan, approached Jack. She claimed to be the lawyer who would defend James during the trial. Jack, upon hearing this, began to question the woman.
Let's go. Eagle?
Fortunately.
How does that happen?
In short, the two of them continued their conversation in a certain place. At that moment, Helen was surprised to find that the person in front of her was a trained military man. She began to question the relationship between Jack and James, as well as the reason Jack wanted to investigate the shooting of 5 civilians. Eventually, Jack explained that James was a former army soldier who had been assigned as a sniper on a mission in Iraq. During his time there, James had killed many enemy soldiers. That was when Jack realized that if someone couldn't change their lifestyle, they could become complacent and continue killing people with their guns. One day, when James was assigned to surveil mafia members in a room, he suddenly opened fire on them all. Finally, Jack learned about James' background and immediately arrested him, threatening him not to commit such heinous acts again. In the case of the civilian deaths, Jack was certain that James was not responsible, as it was unlikely that the perpetrator would leave evidence at the scene of the crime. After explaining James' background, Jack asked Helen to find out the backgrounds of the 5 people who had been shot dead. It was possible that this case involved personal issues. Long story short, Jack arrived at the scene of the crime. There, he began investigating and imagining how the perpetrator shot the victims. However, at the same time, a man named Mike began watching Jack from a distance. Realizing that Jack was a threat to him, Mike informed his superior about it. Just as night fell, Jack stopped by a bar. Since he was alone, he was approached by a sexy woman named Sandy, who immediately invited him to drink with her. However, Jack quickly realized that it was unlikely for a woman to suddenly approach him and offer to drink together. Jack told the woman to leave. Shortly after, 5 thugs arrived, planning to be Sandy's friends. After Sandy left, she complained that she had been harassed by Jack.
Still think you're funny now, creep?
Shut your mouth, Sandy. No one is talking to you.
They didn't challenge Jack to a fight. Finally, Jack accepted the challenge and fought them. At the same time, the police arrived and arrested them. In short, the next day, Jack was detained by the police for his actions the previous night. At the same time, Helen came to discuss the 5 civilians who had been shot dead. From the information she had, the 5 were ordinary people who had not been involved in politics.
PI then, or the DA's office?
Helen began to explain each of the victims from yesterday's incident. The first victim was a laborer who also took care of children. The second victim was a housewife who worked as a cleaner. The third and fourth victims were a manager and an ordinary worker. However, the 5th victim was a bit interesting. She was a woman named Olene Archer, the owner of a company who had recently taken over her husband's position. Immediately after recounting the victims' backgrounds, Jack began to find clues. He began to conclude that the shooting was definitely related to one of the victims, and a reason the perpetrator killed more people was to eliminate the actual motive and purpose. Meanwhile, the film shifts to Mike, who is about to meet someone at a deserted location. That person is Charlie, who appeared earlier in the film. Then, their boss, Zek, arrives, the very person who had planned the murder of the 5 civilians. There, Zeg, who knew that Mike had paid people to attack Jack, became furious. He blamed Mike for his foolish plan, which could lead Jack to discover the mastermind behind all this. To eliminate the evidence, Zeg ordered Charlie to kill Mike. Long story short, the next day, Jack, who was still curious about the person who had paid the thugs during the incident at the bar, asked Helen to take him to the place where Sandy worked. Earlier, Helen had already tracked down the address of where Sandy worked. Upon arriving at the location, Jack was greeted by a man who was Sandy's friend. However, the man said that Sandy hadn't come to work that day. Jack, who didn't believe him, immediately went inside and found Sandy hiding.
No, you are not allowed back in here, man.
After being interrogated, Sandy finally admitted that she had only been paid by her friends without knowing that they actually wanted to beat Jack up. Jack, who realized that Sandy was just an innocent woman, then asked for the address of her friend's residence. Upon arriving at the destination, Jack met an old woman. Since the old woman refused to answer, Jack decided to go inside and search for the thugs. After searching every room, Jack couldn't find them. However, as he was about to enter one of the rooms, Jack was suddenly attacked, leading to a fight. Although he managed to subdue the man, unfortunately, Jack still didn't know who had paid the thugs.
Want to see me again?
No way.
That night, Jack met Helen at her workplace and began explaining the results of his investigation. Jack argued that it was unlikely James would leave evidence at the execution site. The shooting location was directly exposed to sunlight, making it difficult to aim accurately at the target. Jack added that if James had truly intended to kill the 5 people, he would have stayed on the bridge because that position was not directly exposed to sunlight, and the bullet shells would have safely fallen into his own car.
No trace evidence left behind.
Finally, they reviewed the data on the 5 victims from yesterday's incident. Jack was certain that the real target was the female owner of Olene Archer Company, as the data revealed that Olene had an enemy, Labander Enterprise. Therefore, it was highly likely that they had hired a sniper to kill Olene. After uncovering a breakthrough in the case, Jack asked Helen to find out who had been in frequent contact with James. In short, the film shifts to Sandy, who was preparing to meet her boyfriend. However, as she exits the apartment, Charlie attacks her, knocking her unconscious. Several hours later, a police detective arrives to conduct an investigation. From his investigation, the detective concludes that the perpetrator struck the victim with such force that she died. At that moment, Emerson began to suspect that Jack was behind the death, as Jack had previously met Sandy at her workplace. Meanwhile, Jack was seen heading to Sandy's residence. However, he was shocked to learn that Sandy had already died. At the same time, the detective, who had been suspicious of Jack from the start, immediately chased after Jack without further ado.
Suspect is headed north on Stable 65. I need backup and...
During the chase, Jack suddenly ran into Charlie. He immediately chased and tried to stop his vehicle. However, his efforts were in vain because Charlie managed to escape, so Jack had to continue being pursued by security forces. Since the police were still chasing Jack, he finally came up with an idea. Jack slowly got out of his car and hid among the crowd of people waiting for the bus. Having successfully escaped, Jack contacted Helen again to tell her that he was being framed. Wherever Jack went, someone was always following him, so he began to suspect one of the security personnel. He suspected that someone had betrayed him, because so far, he had not met anyone except Helen, Rodan, and Emerson. In short, Jack was seen continuing his investigation because, from the information he had obtained, James had a teacher who often taught him how to shoot. Upon arriving at a gun shop, Jack met an old man named Martin. Jack began to question James' background. However, at that time, Martin did not immediately tell him anything because he was afraid that Jack was a bad person. To make sure that Jack is someone who wants to help free James, Martin tests Jack's shooting skills. If Jack could shoot 4 bullets accurately, Martin would tell him everything he knew about James. Finally, Jack accepted the challenge and immediately went to the shooting range. However, on his first shot, Jack missed the target.
6 inches right.
But for the remaining bullets, he managed to shoot accurately. After seeing all that, Martin believed him and immediately showed a CCTV recording. In the recording, Jack immediately realized that Charlie was the mastermind behind the shootings. From the footage, it was clear that James and Charlie had purchased several boxes of bullets. Meanwhile, the film shifts to Helen explaining to Rodan about the investigation she had conducted with Jack. However, since Jack was now a fugitive, the prosecutor did not believe Helen's words.
Right. My life, your daughter's life, is in danger now.
Since her explanation was outright rejected, Helen left and decided to return to her office. But as she was about to change floors, Emerson suddenly arrived and knocked Helen unconscious. It was revealed that the real traitor was Emerson, who was actually colluding with the Zeg group. When Jack contacted Helen, he grew anxious because Charlie answered the phone. Charlie told Jack that if he wanted to save Helen, he had to come to the Zeg group's headquarters within an hour. They would frame Jack as if he were the one who had killed Helen.
You killed that girl to put me in a frame. I mean to beat you to death.
Long story short, Jack arrived at the Zeg group's headquarters. While monitoring the situation, Martin suddenly arrives and begs Jack to help him wipe out the Zeg forces, because Martin didn't want James to be used as a pawn by them. Finally, they divided the tasks. Jack would go down and approach the headquarters, while Martin would watch from a distance using his sniper rifle. It turned out that Jack approached the base using a car that was deliberately driven in reverse to avoid detection. However, the car was shot at by Charlie, so Martin, who was above, immediately fired at Charlie's group. It turned out that Martin's shots were just a diversion. Jack, who had already exited the car, immediately eliminated them one by one. However, Charlie managed to escape again. Jack then entered the room to search for Helen. It turned out they were holding Helen captive at the mine's central office. Jack immediately went there using the car. Upon arriving, Jack immediately neutralized them one by one. When Charlie was searching for Jack, he was ambushed from behind and couldn't do anything. However, Charlie challenged Jack to a fist fight. Jack beat him to death. Hearing Charlie's screams, Emerson panicked and hid behind Helen. Finally, Jack managed to take down all of Zeg's men. He then approached Zeg and killed him. In short, a few days after James regained consciousness, Helen and Prosecutor Rodan came to ask some questions about the shooting of 5 people at once. At that moment, Helen immediately asked if it was indeed James who carried out the shooting. James immediately replied that he had been framed by Charlie in Zeg's group. Since Charlie did not want to take responsibility for the serial killings, Charlie then accused James by taking his fingerprints while he was sleeping in his house. The bullet found at the crime scene was identical to James's, as Charlie had also taken James's bullet from his house. Thus, it can be concluded that Charlie had used someone else's identity, as if James were the one who did it all. After James explained everything, Helen asked again why. During his interrogation, he had written the words Jack Reacher. James immediately explained that he had only wanted to ask Jack for help so that the case could be handled and resolved. Eventually, Helen realized that the explanation Jack had once told her was exactly the same as James' words, and the film ended.